All right, on to chapter 12. What we're going to be talking about today is closely related to what we talked about in chapter 11, evolution. Chapter 12 expands a little bit on the idea of how all life on the planet is ultimately related. All life on the planet evolved over time. Some things diverged away from each other, some species converged together. But ultimately, all life on this planet evolved from other life forms that existed before it. And given 4.5 billion years or so, we ended up with the millions of different species that we currently have on the planet, in addition to all of the species that have come and gone extinct in the past. So again, a fair amount of this should be somewhat familiar to you, but we're just tying it together here, I guess, with chapter 12. So again, whether you have species that are very closely related, like all the different species of sharks are more like each other than they are anything else, whether things are a little less closely related, like humans and all the other primates on the planet, or whether things are very distantly related, like the bee and the flower that are pictured on the slide. Ultimately, all life on this planet did evolve from common ancestor, and given a very, very long time, we now have the diversity of life that we have on the planet. Again, as long as humans have been on the planet, we've been curious about the world around us. Initially, just maybe to be able to survive, you have to know where you live and how to find food. But then also, as humans evolved, our innate curiosity kind of came to the forefront. People would sit around philosophizing and thinking and talking about things, and we have this innate drive to understand the world around us. We're curious by nature. And so we've gone through a variety of mechanisms that we've used to categorize life on the planet. And right now we primarily use what's called a phylogenetic tree, or what we might also refer to as the tree of life. As I've talked about in the process of evolution on Earth, all of the 3 branches that are shown here, for example, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, which is where we fit, all evolved from a single point in the branch or the tree of life, going back, again, billions of years. Things branched off early, and those branches branched. Some of those species, again, have gone extinct. Others have persisted all the way to today. As I mentioned in the last section, one of the real misconceptions about evolution, and one of the excuses, I guess, that sometimes people use to discount evolution is, well, I didn't, evolve from a fish, or I didn't evolve from a bacteria. And that's true. Again, we didn't. But animals, plants, bacteria, all evolved from a common ancestor. And again, that's a big difference to say that we have a common ancestor versus we all evolved from the same thing. And again, because of the time involved, it's always a challenging concept to get. So there is a branch of science called phylogeny, which are biologists who study evolutionary history, and they seek to be able to organize life, and they do that by studying relationships between living things. How things look, are they similar looking or not? And more recently, of course, we have genetics, DNA that we can work with. And then systematics is the study of these relationships as well. So there are branches of science that basically just focus on trying to name and classify living things and study the relationships between all of the different living things on this planet. So for some time now, going back to Linnaeus, like we talked about last time, we've been using a system of binomial nomenclature, meaning a two-name naming system. Every living thing on the planet has a genus and a species name. The dog is Canis familiaris, which, as we talked about in the previous section, dogs evolved from wolves. So basically wolves and all varieties of dogs on the planet, domestic dogs of course, are related to the wolf, and so they're the same species, Canis lupus. The subspecies is familiaris for all of the domestic dogs. And then, of course, we go from those very specific characteristics that make up a dog or a bear or a human to more general characteristics. And again, the word specific literally refers to species, a species being a unique living thing. There are no two species that are identical to each other. Everyone is unique. And so this binomial system uses, again, the genus and the species to give every living thing on the planet a unique name so that there's no confusion as to what we're talking about. And that's why it's important in science that we use Latin, the language that we use to name living things. It's important because Latin's a dead language. It doesn't change or evolve itself. You look at our current language. Every year, just about, there are new terms that come into existence, right? I mean, when I was starting college, there were a lot of terms that didn't even exist. I mean, things we use every day like email or cell phone. Things as technology evolves and things are invented, we have to come up with names for them. But even just society, there are words that have evolved over time. The word gay, for example, you watch old movies from the 30s and 40s, and gay just meant happy. And then for some reason it picked up a connotation to mean someone that's homosexual. And of course, even that term has evolved over time. Slang terms, unfortunately, that make it into our society. But again, the point that I'm making is that language, a living language like ours, evolves and changes. And so you don't want to name things with a language that's changing all the time. That's why we use Latin, again, dead language, so things don't change when you name them. We don't generally require that people even learn Latin anymore, whereas I think it's important for scientists maybe to know Latin because it helps you understand a lot of the terminology that's used. So anyway, we go from the specific to then the genus. Again, the dogs now also include other species like members of the genus that involve dogs like jackals, the family Canidae, which now includes fox as well, the order Carnivora, meat eaters, which now also includes cats, and a lot of other species, of course, bear, for example. And then those are all in the class Mammalia, which we're also in. But also now we throw in species that are also herbivores, like rabbits and cows and humans, like I said. We expand out to the phylum Chordata, which now includes all living things that have a spinal column, like fish also now, reptiles, amphibians are all in the phylum Chordata. Even broader now, the kingdom Animalia. So all of these things are more animal-like. So now we include insects as well. And then also the domain Eukarya, which now includes plants as well, eukaryotic cells. And so everything in the domain Eukarya have certain things in common. Hopefully you remember from way back at the beginning of the semester, we talked about what eukaryotic organisms are, the characteristics in the cell, nuclear membrane, membrane-bound organelles, etc. And because we share those characteristics with all other members of this domain, that is indicative of these things all being related to each other. Again, some more closely, like the wolf and the dog, some much more distantly, like the cat and the plant. But again, because of these common characteristics, we know these things have a common ancestor going back far enough in time. And again, that was figure 12.3 in your book. For some reason, that slide was a little fuzzy. So we use these tools called phylogenetic trees to be able to visually see how species are related to each other. Again, here we have an example of a phylogenetic tree where we have some of the primates pictured. And so on this phylogenetic tree, you see the humans are over here. And we're off one branch of the tree, along with the bonobo and the chimpanzee. We share a lot more genetically with these two primates, and that's indicative of the fact that, again, we're all on the same branch of this phylogenetic tree. Now keep in mind, again, this is just one little piece of a very, very large tree, right? These are just some of the primates, not even all of the primates. But we focus on this one because it's the one that we're part of. And again, the way this tree is drawn, you can see that, again, we're more related to these other species than we are to this other branch, which incorporates the 3 species of gorilla that we have on the planet. But again, because we branch off of the gorilla more closely or later in the evolutionary tree, we're more related to them than the gorilla are to the next branch, which are the orangutan, of which we have 2 species, the Bornean and the Sumatran. And we're even less or more distantly related to the other branch shown here, which are the gibbons. Gibbons and orangutan are more closely related to each other than they are to the gorilla, or of course to the branch that we go to. So again, this is just a good way to visually see relatedness. On this, we zoom into ours again. We're actually more closely related to the bonobos than we even are the chimpanzee, because again, they branch closer to each other. So again, we always say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and so having these visuals is just a good way to see relatedness. We also could look at these trees almost like a key, to ask a series of yes or no questions to look at characteristics that define various groups. So for example, we zoom into the group of living things that all have a vertebral column. If we go to answer that question as yes, then it takes us to another more specific question or classification, whether members of this group have a hinged jaw or not. If we say no, then that takes us to a type of fish called a lamprey. They've actually got kind of a sucker type mouth. They're the kind of an eel-looking thing that'll latch onto the body of a fish and just kind of, almost like a vampire, suck body fluids out of it to be able to feed itself. If it does have a hinged jaw, then it takes us to other options, including, then does it have legs? No, that would take us to things like fish, or snakes? Does it have legs? And then does it have an egg with amniotic fluid? Humans have amniotic fluid around their embryos as they're developing. No would take it to a frog. Yes would take it to these options. Does it have hair? No. Takes it to a lizard? Yes. Take it to a rabbit. So basically, this is what we would call a key. We use keys all the time in biology to go through and answer yes or no questions about characteristics, and then hopefully that leads us to specifically identifying something. And again, in this case, it's just choosing common characteristics. So things that are in these groups have these common characteristics. So again, I mentioned a little bit ago that we can either look at physical characteristics in determining how species are related to each other, looking at external structures, and we already kind of used or talked about homologous versus analogous structures. Wings that both bats and birds have. They're both wings. They evolved evolutionarily in a similar fashion. The flipper of a whale versus the leg of a horse or the arm of a human all evolved to fit the habitat that each of these different living things live in. The whale's flipper, of course, the arm joints. Again, remember these bones are color coded, so the humerus in the whale got very shortened compared to the humerus in something like us. The radius in the ulna, very shortened. And ultimately, the hand part of the flipper became surrounded with a skin flap instead of having separate manipulatable fingers, because it needs the flipper to be able to push through an aquatic environment. The horse evolved, the same bones evolved to, again, serve a different purpose. A four-legged animal that runs, again, doesn't need fingers. It evolved a hoof to support it and allow it to run. So because we can still trace these bones to being similar, again, every one of these things, whether it's the bird, the bat, the whale, the horse, or the human, all have a bone called a humerus. And all the other bones in the arm and leg and pretty much all the bones throughout the body may be slightly different to adapt to the environment they live in, but because all of these living things have those same bones, which are homologous structures, they indicate we share an evolutionary past with these other living things. We can look at the skull of a human versus a chimpanzee, and we can see that there are some similarities. Generally speaking, we've got forward-facing eyes. We've got similar type of jaws, although the jaw on the chimpanzee protrudes a lot more. And because of different evolutionary traits that we've evolved to be similar needs, humans and chimps, evolving at least somewhat of an upright, walk. Chimps will brachiate, which means they walk on their front limbs as well, but they also have the ability to stand up. And, the evolution of becoming two-legged was important because it freed up our hands. We could pick up things and use them as weapons or use them as tools to do work for us. And all 4 feet or legs or arms have to be on the ground. to just be able to stand or move, it limits what you can do, right? You pretty much have your mouth that you could grab things with. So being able to be upright made a huge difference in our evolution that led ultimately to the chimpanzee and ultimately to the human as well. So, there's some similarities, but also some huge differences. We have a much bigger brain case, a much bigger space inside of our skull where our brain evolved to be what it is today, whereas the chimps still have a much smaller brain case. They're still very intelligent, but not the capacity of the human. But with all those similarities and differences, we still genetically, have about a 99% similarity to each other. So 99% of our DNA is similar. And again, now that we have the ability to know genetically how similar or dissimilar things are, that has really expanded our understanding of evolutionary relationships. So we have those homologous structures, again, birds and bats evolving from similar ancestors. But then we also have those external analogous structures. Wings in bees versus wings in bats are very different. They function for the same general purpose, to allow flight, but the structure of an insect wing is not supported by bones. It's supported by other material like chitin. And so those species, even though they both fly, are far less genetically similar to each other, because again, we don't see the same sort of homologous structures. We see some analogous structures, wings, but because they didn't evolve from the same structures, the same bones, we know that they're far less related to each other. So we use a variety of things on the external structure, right? All birds have feathers, and so those feathers make them unique and obviously more related to each other than they are to mammals that have hair on their bodies. And then the wing structure of the bat, very different than the wing structure of the bee, so they're even less related to each other. But again, one of the really big steps in recent time has been the development of our understanding of DNA sequencing. And so that has allowed us to, again, get a much better understanding using molecular comparisons to understand how closely some things are related. Again, we can tell from anatomy, external and internal, that we have a lot in common with other primates. We can see by looking at other primates that there are a lot of similarities. But then once we were able to genetically test and compare and realize that chimps are 98 to 99% the same as we are genetically, that even strengthens the fact that we have a common ancestor. Again, we didn't evolve from chimps any more than chimps evolved from us, but we did both evolve from a common ancestor. We can look at the mouse. We share 92% in common with mice. And remember, a mouse is still a mammal, as we are. And again, we share a lot in common with them. Only 44% with a fruit fly, but that's still almost half of our DNA is similar to that of a fruit fly. Even a quarter with yeast, single-celled organisms, very ancient living things. And then even more distantly related to plants. At least yeast are still, again, looking at a phylogenetic tree, the branch when yeast went off and we eventually went off is closer than when the plants branched off. We now also, as humans, have the ability, and I think even when I first put this slide a couple years ago, it wasn't even an option, but now these different genetic testing services, 23andMe, Ancestry, now you can send in a sample and they'll give you a better idea on where your ancestors came from, what part of the world or parts of the world that your ancestors came from. Something that just, I don't think was even a thought, not that long ago. And now we have that ability for what, $99 or whatever it is, relatively cheap. That kind of testing might have cost tens of thousands of dollars not that long ago. Now pretty much every human on the planet, or certainly most humans on the planet, would have the ability to get genetic testing done. It also helps us solve crimes. I've heard on a number of occasions where now evidence that was collected years ago and now it's being retested and we're finding matches to people. Sometimes it's even through these genetic testing services, which makes a lot of people ask questions about, shouldn't that be kind of private? If I'm submitting a DNA sample, isn't that like my identity, and can other people just get access to that? Well, at least right now, that seems to be something that a lot of concern being expressed over that. But I guess my philosophy has always been, if you didn't do anything wrong, then what do you got to worry about? But anyway, I understand sort of the privacy issues there. It's more information that's out there. It's technology we have, and it's being used in a variety of ways, including a lot of which we just could never have anticipated. A couple more terms here as we wrap up this chapter. Cladistics is a way that we build phylogenetic trees. And by that I mean we put living things into groups that we call clades. And these are groups that have more similar ancestry to each other. Lizards, rabbits, humans all descended from a common ancestor that had an amniotic egg. Therefore, we all belong to a certain clade. In this case, it's been termed Amniota. In the bigger picture, we also are related to a clade Vertebrata that also contains things that don't have amniotic fluid around their eggs or in their eggs. Fish, lamprey, lancelets. Again, we kind of looked at this on one of those previous slides, but there are different ways that we basically have developed to organize the millions of different living things on the planet. And so cladistics is just one of those methods for building these trees, and they're all based on relatedness of characteristics, right? So that's kind of the common thread. So to look at these shared characteristics, we have to make some assumptions, which we always need to do in science. We build on these assumptions. Doesn't mean that those assumptions don't change, but we have to have that to build on. And that's that all living things are related by evolution from common ancestors, that speciation occurs, in other words, that living things diverge from each other. One species of living thing can become two different species given time, given changes in their habitat, the conditions they're exposed to, but also never more than two at a time. So one species speciates into two, and then maybe that other species could speciate into two, and this one could, but never more than two at a time. You don't go from 1 to 5. And then also that traits change significantly enough over time to be considered that they are in a different state, that they are truly a different species. And so again, those are our assumptions that we work on in the process of developing these phylogenetic trees. We can look at the phylogenetic relationships of living things through ontogeny, which is basically the embryological development. If we look at a number of living things, a member of fish, an amphibian, a reptile, a bird, a mammal, and then also us, we can look early enough in the developmental process after the egg is fertilized and the embryo starts differentiating. At some point early on in all of these different living things, we see some similar characteristics. Sorry, go back to the pen here for a minute. So we know that when a fish becomes an adult, it ultimately has gills, right? It breathes oxygen that's in the water. And so it wouldn't be too surprising that an embryonic fish would have gills. Salamanders spend part of their life in the water, and they have almost like external gills because they're still breathing oxygen from water. Some stay in the water as an adult. Some come and go from the water and they breathe air. Turtles are air breathers, right? But they still have gill slits as an embryo. And then when they become adults, of course, they breathe oxygen out of the air like us. Same with chickens, but as an embryo, they've still got these gill slits, as do rabbits and as do humans. And so embryologically, when we look at these things, we know that, again, they shared a common ancestor because we all have what are called pharyngeal gill slits. So the remnant of a much earlier ancestor that evolved out of the water. Again, fish have tails. Salamanders have tails, turtles have tails, chickens have tails, rabbits have tails as an adult, humans don't. But as an embryo, we still have that remnant tail. And so you can see a variety of characteristics that all of these embryos share. They don't all have these characteristics as adults. Again, rabbits, humans, chickens, turtles don't have gills as adults, but they do as an embryo. As time goes on and as the embryo develops more and more, again, some of those characteristics go away because the adults don't need those traits any longer. Humans don't breathe water. We don't need tails anymore, so those features go away. But again, the fact that we have them as embryos for some stage of our life does indicate a common ancestor. And so we can find these kinds of relationships throughout life on the planet. Again, we call this ontogeny, recapitulates phylogeny. Big bunch of words, but what it basically means is that our evolutionary past is replayed in our embryologic development. So again, as we develop from a single cell through billions of cell divisions into an adult, there are certain stages where common characteristics show up that are from a distant relative, a distant common ancestor. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And so in closing, sometimes people, sometimes even scientists have a tendency to look for a more complex explanation for something. We always like to use this concept in science of maximum parsimony, or Occam's razor, meaning that we should assume the most obvious answer is the correct answer. If you're in Africa and you hear a herd of animals running behind you, it's probably more likely something like zebra or wildebeest than a lot of other things. Conversely, if I'm here in Reading and I'm walking on our college farm and I hear a herd of animals, first thing I'm not going to assume is, oh, those must be zebra. Not saying that there aren't possibilities of zebra here in captivity or in zoos, but the most likely answer is going to be a herd of cow, not a herd of zebra or a bunch of wildebeest running around Reading. We have a tendency, and crop circles, for example, there's no doubt that humans have admitted to making crop circles. And there are others that people haven't admitted to, and some that people explain that there's no way a human could have done that. It popped up overnight, and it's way too complex of a pattern for it to be a human. And so we immediately jump to, well, it has to be aliens. Can't be anything else. That's the only reasonable explanation is it must be aliens. Now, I believe there's life in our universe. Maybe it's here on planet Earth, but I have no doubt there's other intelligent life forms out there on other planets or other galaxies and different universe, whatever. But to just jump immediately and say it's it's not easily explained, therefore it must be aliens or it must be magic or whatever. Some of the programs on television, the people on those programs make these leaps all the time. It used to be that Discovery and Animal Planet and History were channels that you could sort of trust in respect to, that if they were talking about it, you sort of assume they did their research and they were being responsible and throwing out theories that had been tested and so forth. And if you watch any of those channels, there's a lot of stuff on there now that's not the case. Some irresponsible stuff, but also just jumping from, well, it's complex, it's weird, I don't know how humans could have possibly done that 5,000 years ago, therefore it must have been aliens. I mean, maybe it was, we don't know. None of us on this planet were there when Stonehenge was built or the pyramids were built. But most of the things that I've seen that some groups are quick to say, well, that's alien technology, or how could we have developed that without the help of aliens? Most of the time when I've read other science on that stuff, there are scientists that have developed hypotheses and actually tested them, and in most cases they've come up with an explanation that's plausible. Again, it doesn't mean it's the right one. It doesn't mean it's how it was done. But just to make a jump, and I'm just picking on the alien thing now because it's easy, but just to jump and say, well, it's this or it's that, without testing it, without researching it, is a little irresponsible, at least from a scientific standpoint. So again, we try to follow Occam's razor. The most plausible explanation is usually the right one. If you look for a complex and a convoluted explanation, it's usually not the one that's going to turn out to be the best explanation. All right, so again, short chapter today. Just a little reinforcement on the process of evolution, and we'll pick up on the next section. Remember, we're going to skip a whole bunch of chapters now throughout the middle of the book. Again, not that it isn't interesting stuff. If you're in lab, we'll be spending the rest of the semester looking at diversity. So we'll be having lab activities where we are going to be looking at examples of the species that are talked about in the next several chapters. Chapter 13 talks about diversity of microscopic stuff, fungi, protists. And then it moves on to diversity of plants and diversity of animals. So we're not going to cover those chapters in lecture. We'll be covering that content in lab. And so we're going to be skipping ahead and then basically for the rest of the semester covering chapters 19, 20, and 21. So make sure you double check the syllabus before you start reading the next chapter, because we will be skipping again ahead a number of chapters. See you next time.